And we are live. And we are live. Boxie. Boxie, we have guests. Yes, yes, we do. Hi, everybody. Greetings and good morning. This is my monthly Ask Me Anything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel. Only George Hodel, Steve Hodel questions. The Black Dahlia questions are that's the first Tuesday of the month. And I will say right now, I usually get trolls. If I do, I will report them immediately. I don't put up with that stuff. So that is the first order of business. Now, before we get going, before I say anything else, Instagram, you're a little crooked there. Sorry about that. This is September. Next month is October. And what do we do in October? We don't dress up like the Black Dahlia for Halloween. Don't do that. No, 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 no. Don't do it. Whatever people want to accomplish by dressing up like the Black Dahlia, like the victim of this horrible murder for Halloween, don't do that. Just don't. No, just don't do that. No. So that's the first order of business, is to remind people that for Halloween, we do not dress up like the Black Dahlia. Just don't do that. Second of all, if you're new, who is this Larry Harnisch guy? And why is he ranting and raving about Steve Hodel? Okay, I have been fact-checking Steve Hodel since the publication of the OG Black Dahlia Avenger in 2003. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Mostly I'm going to talk about this one, okay? This is what we're going to talk about today. Steve published the book in 2003 and got a lot of traction based on his career as a retired homicide detective. Retired homicide detective says dead dad is serial killer is almost irresistible. But mostly, pretty much everything Steve Hodel says is a lie. Steve Hodel lies. He lies all the time. He lies about everything. He is a 24/7 bullshit factory. And let me tell you, if you don't know anything about law enforcement, if you don't know anything about the history of Los Angeles, if you don't know anything about the court system, the legal system, rules of evidence, if you don't know anything about that, jury instructions, if you don't know how grand juries work, if you don't know anything about the medical profession, if you don't know anything about the art world, you can't imagine just how much he fakes, how much he lies. You just can't imagine how much he's faking it. And so my objective all along has been to expose Steve Hodel, not just for me personally, but for the all the damage that Steve Hodel has done in all these claims about his dad and his family, none of which are true. His dad didn't know Elizabeth Short. His dad never killed anybody. That's all. It's this parallel universe. Anyway, that's kind of how I got started and what I have been doing. So let's go on here and talk about we're going to talk about this book right here, which is the paperback version of OG, Black Dahlia Avenger. Okay, here's the story. And it's about me and James Ellroy and Steve Hodel. And why am I talking about this? Because Steve Hodel recently posted on his blog about Steve Hodel, man of honor, man of character. When James Ellroy, forward by James Ellroy, when James Ellroy repudiated Steve Hodel's alleged solutions, then Steve, out of man of honor, man of dignity, said, well, I told my publisher that I didn't want James Ellroy's forward by James Ellroy in any more copies of my book. So I had my publisher delete that forward. Okay, which he then published on his blog. Okay, so what is the real story? Okay, settle in for a talk about me and James Ellroy and Steve Hodel and George Hodel and Black Dahlia Avengerland. Here we go. I got to know James Ellroy in 1996. At that time, I was working for the Los Angeles Times, and I was doing a big story on the 50th anniversary of the Black Dahlia case. And one of the people I interviewed was James Ellroy. Made sense, right? He had written this novel, The Black Dahlia, that really put him on the map. Later made into an atrocious movie by Brian De Palma. And Ellroy and I were cordial. In retrospect, I would have said we were friends. I'm not sure anybody can really be friends with James Ellroy for very long. James goes through people pretty quickly. I lasted from about 7 years, something like that. So, anyway, James and I were cordial. We were friends. He would call me up on the phone. We would talk. When he was in Los Angeles, we would get together. He would say, well, I will set you up with my agent. I will write the introduction to your book. Does that sound familiar? I will set you up with my agent. I will write the introduction to your book. He was very supportive, to the extent that we did James Ellroy's Feast of Death. We filmed that in 2000. I think it was 2001 at the Pacific Dining Car, which was a very popular James Ellroy hangout. Not only out of business, but I think it was burned in an arson. I think it's gone. Anyway, but James and I were pretty cordial. I was the one who suggested, hey, James, you really ought to do a reissue of The Badge, Jack, since it was so influential in your life, with an introduction. Why don't you do a new edition of that? So he did. That was my idea. And I didn't get, I didn't do it for the credit. It seemed like a logical thing to do. Anyway, we were cordial. Anytime James was in town, we would get together. One time we cruised, Lamert Park in the Black Dahlia crime scene. He and I did that, that sort of thing. And as far as I knew, everything was fine. We did Feast of Death as I said, we shot it, I believe, in 2001. And it took a while for it to be released. It came out later, but that's when we shot it. Was my recollection? It was in the summer of 2001. I'm a little vague on that without checking, but pretty sure it was in 2001. Anyway, so Black Dahlia Avenger OG comes out in 2003. Okay, and as a result of that book, as a result of the book, long story short, Steve Lopez, this is Steve Lopez's exact copy of Black Dahlia Avenger. When Steve was done with it, he gave it to me. So that is the exact Steve Lopez's exact copy. Anyway, long story short, Steve Lopez got access to Boxie. We're talking about you. Steve Cooley, who was district attorney at the time, gave Steve Lopez access to OG Boxie. This is a copy. This is a clone of Boxie. The original is at the district attorney's office. Anyway, and so Steve Lopez went through the Black Dahlia, the district attorney's Black Dahlia files, and wrote a column about it. And that was kind of it. I think he did a follow-up. Anyway, I got a call from a guy named Steve Clemens, who wrote for LA Weekly. And he says, hey, I got assigned to do a story about the district attorney's files in the Black Dahlia case. I'm going to go down to the district attorney's office. Do you want to go? And so I said, well, mostly it's not going to be interesting. Mostly it's going to be the Leslie Dillon fiasco. And indeed, sorry, Boxie, most of Boxie is the Leslie Dillon fiasco. Most of it is just very unhelpful. There are some nuggets in there, but you really have to dig for them. Anyway, he said, oh, come on. I said, well, okay. So I met Steve Clemens downtown. We walked up to the criminal courts building. We went up to the district attorney's office, and we met a very very nice, very respected lady named Sandy Gibbons. Sandy Gibbons worked in the Public Information Office, Press Relations, Media Relations Office for the district attorney. And she was great. Sandy is one of the most respected people in the court system, in the media. She did a terrific job. She had been in journalism for a long time. She had been at City News Service. She had been at the Daily News. She really knew her stuff. And so she said, well, okay, and Boxie here is distilled from several boxes. What happened was the district attorney was purging records to make room for new stuff because they were running out of room. So somebody said, hey, these files look important. Maybe we ought to save them. And so they shoveled them into boxes. And sorry, Boxie. The original OG Boxie is just paper, like somebody had taken a shovel and put it in a box and shaken it like that. So I took one box, Steve Clemens took the other, and we just started going through it. And then he found what he needed, and he left. And I stuck around. And me being me, because I have a library background and a research background, I copied everything. Yes, my little clone of original Boxie. I didn't copy quite everything. There are a few things I didn't take. There was a lot of crackpot mail. I didn't copy all of it because it's very repetitive and nutty. And then we weren't allowed, Sandy would not allow us to copy the body shots. There were morgue shots in the file that we were not allowed to copy. They're out there, but we weren't allowed to copy those particular photos. And so again, me being me, I made a date to come back to Sandy's office and photocopy everything else. I photocopied everything in the file except for, as I said, some of the crackpot mail and the photographs. And I am getting to your point. My point, I haven't forgotten about it. So this was 2003 after the book came out. So who should come by one day to the district attorney's office but Rick Jackson and James Ellroy? They were going to have lunch with Steve Cooley. And this book had come out. This book was out by that point, obviously. And so I said, the subject of Steve Hodel came up with Rick Jackson. And Rick Jackson had retired and come back, and he was head of the LAPD cold case unit. And he was buddies with Ellroy. And then they drifted apart, and then they got together. Rick Jackson is a whole story unto himself. He is like the godfather of LA crime writers. He's tight with Ellroy. He's tight with Michael Conley. He's an advisor on Michael Conley's different projects. He's buddies with Miles Corwin. And I know Rick a little bit. Anyway, so Rick Jackson and James Ellroy show up after this. And James Ellroy's quote is, "Fuck Steve Hodel." And you can, knowing Ellroy, you can picture him saying, "Fuck Steve Hodel." Wow, really? Fuck Steve Hodel. Okay. And why is that? Fuck you, Steve Hodel, for saying that his dad killed my mom. Because that's one of Steve Hodel's claims, is that George Hodel killed Geneva Ellroy. And, it's part of this, my dad committed every famous unsolved murder on the planet. So he said that his dad killed Geneva Ellroy. So James was totally, fuck you, Steve Hodel, fuck Steve Hodel, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. That was one of the last times I saw James Ellroy. What was there? What happened next? All of a sudden, Black Dahlia Avenger, forward by James Ellroy. And I don't look at this copy. I don't look at this stuff real often, but I got out this copy. And right inside, right here, is James Ellroy's phone number. I don't know why James Ellroy's phone number is written in this copy of the book, but it is. I don't know why. I don't know I don't know if that's James' handwriting. It's not my handwriting. So I don't know if it's Steve Lopez's handwriting or whoever. Anyway, I've got Ellroy's phone number written in the book. It is 831. No, I'm not going to dox James Ellroy. Anyway, but James wrote the foreword. And this is, let's see. What is the date on this? It was after, okay, 2004. Okay, so next year. And so James writes this. And I ran into Rick. I never saw, I hadn't seen Ellroy for a long time after that. And so Rick Jackson was kind of like, well, James is James. And what happened was, and this should surprise no one, James Ellroy, and I knew James for about 7 or 8 years. James Ellroy is a publicity whore. He will do anything for publicity. He considered Black Dahlia his literary property, his intellectual property. Now, because he got burned by Steve Hodel, he doesn't talk about it at all. Anyway, James, wrote this foreword that is in the Hodel book, and then Steve Hodel, man of principle, dropped. He writes the introduction, and it's this, he signs off on Steve Hodel's solution, and then later on, he backs away from that and says, well, no. But they had, Ellroy and Hodel had a relationship for a while. Steve Hodel sent, Ellroy inscribed copies of his book, which later turned up. I find this so hilarious. Steve Hodel's inscribed books to James Ellroy showed up on eBay. And I put in a bid for them just for humor. I didn't get them. I don't know what they sold for. I forget, because it was a long time ago. But yeah, Ellroy's copies of Hodel's book showed up on eBay, which I find absolutely hilarious. Anyway, James backed away from the whole thing, and now doesn't discuss it at all. And I think Hodel described it as pissing backwards, which is an LAPD expression. Anyway, yeah. So the other thing about, and I was reminded of this in reading forward by James Ellroy. I read this morning, and the lasting damage is when Steve Hodel's book came out. He had a connection at, I think it was the NBC affiliate, and he was in, I think the TV show was 48 Hours. They dug up some stock footage of VJ Day on Hollywood Boulevard, and 48 Hours said, well, we're not sure, but we think this is footage of Elizabeth Short on Hollywood Boulevard on VJ Day. So what does James Ellroy say in his foreword? He watched this video over and over, and he's chosen to believe that it's Elizabeth Short. No, it's not. No. And that is, and I think if you go on Steve Hodel's site, he will still say, oh yeah, that movie, that footage is of Elizabeth Short. No, it's not. It's just some random woman on VJ Day. We know when VJ Day was, and we know where Elizabeth Short was on that particular day. She was in Medford. There's no question about it. That's where she was. So it's just some random woman that people have decided ought to be Elizabeth Short, but it's not. So that was kind of, and again, I think the last time I saw Ellroy was they had a press event for the Brian De Palma movie, Black Dahlia, and they rented a floor of the Biltmore. And at that point, I was doing I was doing an interview for America's Most Wanted, and the producer was a very industrious guy named Fred Peabody, and he said, "Hey, let's go to the Biltmore. They've got a press event, because normally it costs an arm and a leg to shoot at the Biltmore. The Biltmore is very protective about it." So anyway, We go up, Fred Peabody and I and the camera crew from America's Most Wanted go up to the penthouse. And, oh, there's Scarlett Johansson, there's so-and-so. And it's like, no, we don't care about that. We're going to get Ellroy. And the first words out of Ellroy's mouth were, don't anyone say the name Steve Hodel. So, and that was it. I might have seen him one more time after that, but I forget. It's been a long, long time. But that's kind of that's kind of the story of me and James Ellroy and Rick Jackson and Black Dahlia Avenger. I will mention, because it's important, Rick Jackson. I mentioned Rick Jackson was the head of the cold case unit, the LAPD cold case unit. Yeah. And Rick told me directly, this was the head of the LAPD cold case unit, said, well, you know what? We looked at Steve Hodel's claims, and if there had been anything to them at all, we would have signed off on it just to get it off the books. But no, there's nothing to it. And so that was, as far as I'm concerned, it isn't the big LAPD cover-up, nothing like that. It's just, we looked at it and it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. And so that was kind of the end of the story. But yeah, so Steve Hodel, man of principle, now says, why he had this, he felt that since James Ellroy no longer endorsed his solution, that he would, out of principle, Steve Hodel, such a man of principle, had it taken out of the books. I don't know. But anyway, that is the saga of me and James Ellroy and Steve Hodel. I did, just to kind of wrap it up, I did I did a couple of interviews. There's a guy who did a biography of James Ellroy. He's a Brit, and he interviewed me, and I come across as, this bitter, it's like, no, I think James is a joke. He writes this racist, sexist crapola that, I can't believe, if he didn't already have a bunch of selling books, he'd never be able to peddle his last stuff. It's unreadable. But anyway, no, I think James Ellroy is, he's a messed up guy who doesn't know how to be friends with anybody. He's all about him. Anyway, so that's kind of my yarn about that. And now it is time to throw it open to questions. Now, I got a question here on Instagram. Let me see if I can scroll back. Yes, I can. Did Ellroy tell me that he had read the autopsy report? Yes. That was one of James Hodel, that's one of James Ellroy's claims, is that he read the Elizabeth Short autopsy. Ellroy's story goes like this. This is what he told me. He was doing a book reading, and a young guy from the coroner's office showed up, and he wanted to go into rehab, and he needed money to go into rehab. And so Ellroy gave him some money, got the Elizabeth Short autopsy report, read it, and then used his official channels to return it to the coroner's office. And I asked James, I said, did you copy it? No. And I said, yeah, bullshit. And I should mention that one of Steve Hodel's claims, going back to this, is that the LAPD pressured James Ellroy to back off on Steve's claims. No. Let me tell you something. Nobody pressures James Ellroy to do anything. I knew that man for 7 or 8 years, and nobody pressures him to do anything. He does what he wants to do. If he dropped Steve Hodel, it was simply because he wanted to. Anyway, but Ellroy told me that he had read it, but he had the details wrong as usual. He said, well, she had her ovaries switched. No, No, that's, that's one of these scuttlebutt stories. He hadn't read it. Um, and the actual story about Elizabeth Short autopsy records at the coroner's office is that they are sealed at the request of the LAPD. Uh, I have heard two stories. I've heard that it's missing, and I've heard that it's sealed at the LAPD's request. The more uh, the preponderance of evidence seems to be that it was sealed at the LAPD's request. So I think that's what the most anybody has of the Elizabeth Short medical examination is what was read into the inquest by Frederick Newbar. It's incomplete. What happened was the inquest. The inquest was like a little trial. You would have the deputy coroner as the judge. You would have witnesses who would be sworn in, and then you would have a jury, little jury, petite jury. And you would have typically a police officer. In the case of Elizabeth Short's inquest, you had her mom. You had, this is my daughter. You had Red Manley. Yeah, I left her at the Biltmore. You had one of the detectives say, yeah, we found her at the crime scene and blah, 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 and etc. And then the last person to testify at the inquest was Frederick Newbar, the medical examiner. And he started reading the autopsy report, and it was like every scratch and everything else that had been done to her. And so the deputy coroner cuts him off and says, this is really long and involved. Can you just say why she died? And so he jumps. He doesn't include everything. But there is nothing at all in the autopsy report about switched ovaries. That's total crap. That was a rumor that was prevalent at one time, and I think either fell out of favor or whatever. But Ellroy did tell me that. He did tell me that story. I kind of don't believe it, but he did tell me that. The main thing being, when I asked him, did you copy it? He said no. And I know, having been friends with Ellroy for a long time, I know that James copies stuff. He was, I can't remember the killer's name now, but he was this horrible guy who he killed this teenage boy out in the he killed this teenage boy out under Santa Monica Pier, and I can't remember the guy's name, but Ellroy has stuff, but that was not it. Anyway, so yeah, he did tell me that story, but I didn't believe him. So let's see. Well, it's the thing about Ellroy is he will say that he won't talk about his mom's murder anymore, and he won't talk about the Black Dahlia case, and he won't talk about me. So that's kind of where James is. But again, James he's totally into the demon dog persona, and he keeps that going. And the East Coast publishing world, they love the demon dog. Okay, hang on a second. Isn't the autopsy public record? Yes and no. I mean, if the LAPD wanted it sealed, it's going to be sealed. There is kind of the defining question is whether the case is solved. If the case is unsolved, then and the courts a few years ago gave the police like more legal standing to keep records sealed if a case is open. And so that's what they've done with the Black Dahlia case. The Black Dahlia case is a jam-packed file cabinet in robbery homicide. I have seen the file cabinet. Brian Carr unlocked it for me. I could see it. I couldn't dig through it, but I will tell you right now, it is crammed to the brim with paper, loaded. Okay. Let's see here. Was anyone acquainted with both Dr. George Hodel and Elizabeth Short? You know what, Adrian? In Frank Jimison's final report, he refers to a man who said he knew Elizabeth Short and George Hodel, and in his opinion, George Hodel did not know Elizabeth Short. I think it's something like Rudolph Waltham, something like that. It is humanly impossible to remember every name and every detail, but yeah. There was one person who said that there was this unfortunate lady named Lillian Norak who was just crazy, just bonkers crazy. And she's the one in Boxie who said, oh, yeah, George Hodel dated Elizabeth Short. But no. And when you research the life of poor old Lillian Norak, I mean, she was nuts. She ended up in Camarillo, which was the mental institution, and she got killed in this bizarre story where she was riding in a car with a guy. They had a fight. She said, nope, leave me out here. And they were like outside Palm Springs. It was the middle of nowhere. And so, let me out, let me out. The guy lets her out, and she gets picked up by somebody and is found murdered in the desert. I mean, the woman would have been an atrocious witness, very unreliable. So, but that's it. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, Ellroy's line to me was, as far when I got to know James, his belief was that the Black Dahlia was his literary property. He owned that. And he would say, Janice Knowlton, don't give her any ink. John Gilmore, don't give him any ink. Will Fowler is full of shit. Well, Will Fowler was full of shit, as it turned out, but I still gave him some ink simply because, first of all, I didn't realize how much Will lied to me, and second of all, he was there to some extent. So anyway, but that, that's, let's see. Okay. But no, there's nothing to show a connection. There really is nothing to show a connection between George Hodel and Elizabeth Short. They didn't know each other. And I will point out, as I have pointed out many times, the window when they overlapped is very narrow. Okay. George Hodel got back from China in like the middle of September 1946, and Elizabeth Short leaves Los Angeles for San Diego in early December. So they only overlapped for a couple of months. It was a very brief time. And Steve will come up with this, Elizabeth Short posed for a painting for Man Ray or a photograph. And, Man Ray introduced Elizabeth Short to my dad, or my dad introduced Elizabeth Short to Man Ray. None of that's, not a word of that's true. No, that is totally, totally, totally bogus. No. So let's do some of let me do one of the submitted questions here. Steve Hodel recently wrote to one of his fans, I have no memory of any of the documented child neglect abuse when our mother was arrested in 1944 and 45. But in later years, at the Southern Franklin house, I should have stronger memories. For example, when my half-sister Tamara apologized in 2001 for having sex with me, I had no knowledge of what she was talking about. I responded, sex. What, like kissing? No, Tamar said, no, we had intercourse. I was 8 years old then, so I should definitely remember an incident like that, but I didn't. So blocked? What else did I block? Do you think that someone who blocked something so important is capable of solving the Black Dahlia's case? Well, okay. I mean, I could spend 15 or 20 minutes, and maybe I will, talking about Tamar. Tamar was just wild. She was a train wreck. Tamar was unreliable from the get-go. Tamar is Steve Hodel's older half sister, and she had been, her mom had sent her to a psychiatrist I think at the age of 7 or 8, it came out in court testimony that because she was a compulsive liar, she lied about everything. Again, you know, a lot about men and sex, and she kept doing. She would accuse her. I mean, Tamar's go-to strategy was to accuse men of molesting her. She did it all the time. That was one of the things that came out in the trial of George Hodel, because, of course, Tamar also accused George of molesting her. George and 13 boys at Hollywood High School also, you know, they all were after her. So, you know, Tamar is just such a train wreck. I wouldn't believe anything she said. I absolutely wouldn't. But when Steve says, I have no memory of any of the documented child abuse, neglect when our mother was arrested in 44 and 45. What am I talking about? I'm talking about Steve's claims that he and his brothers lived at the Sowden house, and you'll hear him say it on the podcast. We lived at the Sowden house. Dad was the king. Mom was the queen. And we 3 boys, we were the 3 princes. Okay. And he'll say he remembers glittery cocktail parties at the Sowden house. No, he didn't remember. He doesn't remember that. It didn't happen. How could I be so sure? Because Steve's parents divorced in about 1944. Steve was 3. Maybe he wouldn't remember that. You know, Steve was born in 41. So yeah, he's 3 or 4 years old. Maybe he doesn't remember that. But what is documented in the news stories is that his mom kept getting arrested for child neglect. The neighbors would call the authorities and say, hey, Dorothy is neglecting the kids again. They're filthy and dirty and whatnot. And Dorothy got arrested. She got put on probation, and she finally went to jail for neglecting Steve and his brothers. That's what really happened. Now, Steve says he has no memory of that. I don't know. That is what's in the newspapers, okay? Not glittery cocktail parties at the Sowden house. Why he would just blithely say these things, not remembering them, is a question. It's like, well, if you don't remember this stuff, where is it coming from? So, yeah, I mean, it's just Steve has created this alternative universe, this parallel reality where his father is a prolific serial killer and criminal genius who travels the world committing famous unsolved murders, only unsolved murders and only famous ones. He doesn't do the low level unknown unsolved murders, only the famous unsolved murders. And Steve's main technique is thought prints. He uses thought prints, whatever they are. Let's see. I thought maybe you convinced Ellroy that the Steve Hodel theory was bogus, or Rick Jackson. Either way, it's funny. Yeah, no, James drops people. He goes through people. He drops people. He certainly dropped me. I think he dropped Steve Hodel a lot faster. The big, I think the underlying issue in my relationship with James Ellroy is in James Ellroy's mind. Okay. He is the greatest living American author, not the greatest living author of genre fiction, the greatest living American author, period. In his mind, that's what he believes. And I hadn't read his books at that point. I tried to later on, but he was always a little peeved with me that I didn't read his books, and I didn't think he was this magnificent author. Well, I worked at the LA Times. I worked with a building full of great writers, a lot of them better than James Ellroy, like Michael Conley. Anyway, so I wasn't impressed with, it's like I work with tons of writers. That's to me, that's no big deal. Anyway, I think that was always one of the bones of contention between me and Ellroy, is I didn't salute him as, the world's, America's greatest living author, which he thinks he is. And he disses Raymond Chandler all the time. Oh, Raymond Chandler's, I'm tons better than Raymond Chandler. Anyway, I was wondering if the jigsaw murders in the Philippines that Steve says his father committed Was that killer ever caught? I don't think so. The thing about those murders is that Steve will come up. Steve does a lot of things with, like, I call it map torture, where he will say, well, Zodiac Street is a block away, and I forget if it's Dahlia Street or something like that. Okay, no. It was like a block from his, one block in one direction was Zodiac Street, and another way was, I forget the name of the street. I'm going to call it Dahlia. I don't know if it is. Anyway, none of that's true. If you go to a map of Manila, we can do that now because of Google. We can measure where those streets are. They're not at all close, no. And whether, Steve says they are just like the Black Dahlia, whether they are in reality is something else again. Let's see. Yeah, I don't follow that stuff. It is so tangential to the Black Dahlia case. And, the reality is that Steve Hodel has devoted the last 21 years of his life, 24/7, to establishing his father as this serial killer and criminal genius. Steve never stops. He never lets up. He's running out of steam now, but he never lets up. So, I can't possibly keep on top of everything, but I have a working knowledge. Let's see. I've got one over here. Yeah, you know what? Over on Instagram, I went through the testimony in the trial of George Hodel, and I will tell you now, you cannot believe what Steve Hodel says about anything. What happened was this, and I went through the original news reports, and I suggest that anybody who wants to do that, don't listen to Steve Hodel. All the newspaper reports are online now. If you want to read the news stories about the George Hodel case, they're there. And when Steve says, "Oh, head of LA County Health Department arrested," no, because when George Hodel was arrested, he wasn't even head of the county health department. That is more Steve Hodel BS. Steve Hodel is horrible with details. He is absolutely atrocious. He can't get anything right. So no. So it's pretty clear from the testimony by Steve's older half brother, Duncan, that Tamar went down, and the backstory is with the whole Tamar Hodel thing. And I did a whole episode on the trial of George Hodel. Tamar was a handful. She was an incorrigible teenage girl, and her mom was exhausted, absolutely exhausted. I think the mom had a heart attack finally dealing with Tamar. She had shipped Tamar off to a girls' school to try to straighten her out. Tamar was a real piece of work, even as a teenager. And so the mom finally says, "Okay, I've had it with you. I am shipping you down to Los Angeles," because they lived in the Bay Area. "I'm shipping you down to LA to live with your father." Well, Tamar lives in the Bay Area. She doesn't want to go down to Los Angeles. She doesn't want to live with Dad. George Hodel is living the swinging single life. He doesn't want this incorrigible teenage girl on his hands. Did anybody think that was going to turn out anything other than a disaster? No, it was a disaster. But, and this is what came out in testimony from Duncan. Tamar told Duncan before she went down, "I am going to accuse Dad of molestation. It won't be true, but the cops won't know that, and I'll get him in trouble." And that was her intention from the get-go. And I should point out that in the trial, the majority of the jury were women. It wasn't like you see in I Am the Night where the jury's all men. The jury was predominantly women. It was either 8-4 or 9-3, one or the other. But they didn't buy her story either. None of them did. And they had testimony from Tamar's mom, grandmother, came down, other women who had known Tamar, and they all said the same thing. We wouldn't believe a word of what Tamar says under oath. And it wasn't just, "Oh, well, we're victim blaming." No, she was, and if you look at the rest of Tamar Hodel's life, she was a train wreck, So Don't believe her on anything. Do I know if John Huston ever visited the Sowden house? I do not know. I would be surprised. Again, Steve plays up any potential connection, Hollywood connection. He will tell you that, oh yeah, they were, like Dad and John Huston were like this, and John Huston was the first husband of his mom. Okay, that's who John Huston. Why John Huston figures into it. And that mom was a script doctor. No, that's all Steve Hodel bullshit too. None of that's true. So whether John Huston, the only thing we know, independently of what Steve claims, is there's a bunch of letters at the Motion Picture Academy from Steve Hodel's mom, Dorothy, to John Huston. They're in the John Huston papers. And Steve has kind of, cherry picked them. But it's just tales of woe. I'm broke. Things are terrible. I can't sell a story. I got a radio, I'm writing a radio script. And she'll come up with movie ideas that are obviously not going anywhere. So I think Steve overplays that connection as he does everything. So let's see. Was Hodel ever acquainted with Walter Bailey? There's no reason to believe that at all. None. They operated in different realms. I mean, people have I should dig out my Los Angeles phone book for 1946. It's like this, okay? People want to believe that everybody in this book knew each other. No, they didn't. It's just like now. People didn't know each other. There's no reason to believe that Bailey and Hodel knew each other at all. No. Let's see. Okay. Bit of a strange question. Does Ruth Spalding have any relatives who are alive? I've tried to have a look find my gravesite, but no luck. Okay. Who is Ruth Spalding? Ruth Spalding was George Hodel's secretary. She committed suicide. And Steve has moved heaven and earth to try to prove that George was a suspect. And he'll say it's in here, Boxie. It's not. No, it's not. He will move heaven and earth to say that George was suspected of killing his secretary. No, he was not. George Hodel was never, ever suspected of killing his secretary. Nobody was. No one was ever suspected of killing her because she committed suicide with an overdose of barbiturates. And Steve will say, oh, well, George, my dad, forced her to commit suicide. Have you ever tried that with pills? I mean, my standard answer is, look, have you ever tried to give a pill to a cat? Do you know how hard that is? Imagine trying to give a whole bunch of barbiturates to somebody who doesn't want to take them. Because if you're going to if you're going to off yourself with barbiturates, you need to pretty much take a whole bottle, and they were little bottles, with alcohol. You had to. It took alcohol and barbiturates together to kill yourself. And so we have her death certificate. It's online. I put it online. It was a strict suicide. The coroner's office investigated the death. It was suicide. So she wasn't murdered. And at that point, for me, that's the end of the story. I think she had family who were living in LA. I think she was local. I think she was from LA. I think she had parents who were living here. Do they have any living relatives? I don't know. Why does that matter? Why does it matter? I mean, she is just a lady who killed herself in the 1940s. And if it weren't for Steve Hodel trying to build up this fictional stuff about his dad killing her, we wouldn't care. I mean, it's a sad story. We don't know why she committed suicide. I don't believe she left a note. A lot of people who commit suicide don't leave notes. We don't know why they kill themselves. But that's a whole nother thing. But in terms of, does she have any living relatives? I've never bothered to look. I don't care. Once she's out of the picture, then there's because there's so many people in the Black Dahlia case, you can't possibly track down the life stories of everybody. And it's just, she's a footnote, she has one, she comes in and if it weren't for Steve, nobody would care. Okay. I remember you saying that George Hodel was out of the country during the Chicago lipstick murders. I don't think I said that. I'm pretty sure I didn't. You might be confusing me with somebody else. I think it's more accurate to say, no, wait a minute. The let's see. The lipstick murders, I'm not sure about. Suzanne Degnan was killed in January of 46. And I'd have to check and see when he went to China. I don't have that information at the top of my head. I can't tell you off the top of my head when he went to China. He did go to China. And I forget the exact dates. I know that he didn't get back from China until September of 46. But by then, they had arrested William Hirons. So my complaint is that Steve never lays the groundwork in accusing his dad of killing Suzanne Degnan. Who is Suzanne Degnan? Suzanne Degnan was this little girl tragically killed in Chicago. And there is this crackpot theory that Elizabeth Short's body was left on Norton Avenue. And I feel embarrassed saying anything because it's so fucking stupid. That Elizabeth Short's body was left on Norton as a pointer to Degnan. Steve stole that idea. There was a guy who was a total nut job, and he came up with the idea of Elizabeth Short's body being left on Norton as a pointer to Degnan. Steve has said, oh yeah, my dad, the genius, he made a wrong turn and he meant to go on Degnan and ended up on Norton, which is a couple of blocks away. And at this point, Steve says, oh, well, he will say the body of Elizabeth Short was left off Degnan. It's like, no, no, that's not what happened at all. I mean, the guy, if you don't know this stuff in a lot of detail, you can't imagine how much he just switches things around. It's bizarre. It really is bizarre. Anyway, I would have to look up exactly when George Hodel left LA and came back. I know he came back in September, but I forget now when he left. But he did. Okay. Thanks. In China as of December of 45. Okay, so that would preclude him from killing Suzanne Degnan. Okay, let's see here. Do you think there's any documentation or evidence that would prove LAPD covering up or even knowing who the murderer was? Okay. I'm going to have to talk fast on this one. Steve's thing about the LAPD was a real life LA Confidential. The cops are corrupt. No. People float that idea so they can push these bizarre solutions. The police were inept or corrupt. And you will find that in certainly Black Dahlia Avenger, but you will also find that in the Don Wolf book, Black Dahlia Files. You will find that in Daddy Was the Black Dahlia Killer. The police were inept. That kind of thing. John Gilmore just, they never stumbled across Jack Anderson Wilson. But the others, and P. Wheatwell, of course, the police were inept and or corrupt. No, that they're not. The investigation of the Black Dahlia case was state of the art for 1947. The lead detectives on it, Harry Hansen and Finus Brown, were sharp. They were very good, seasoned detectives, particularly Harry Hansen. Harry Hansen had been with the department for about 20 years at that point, and he was one of the best. What people will trot out as proof of LAPD corruption is the Brenda Allen scandal. Okay, who's Brenda Allen? Brenda Allen was a Hollywood madam. She was involved with a guy named Charlie Stoker. Okay, who's Charlie Stoker? Vice. Okay, so Brenda Allen, LAPD corruption. Did Brenda Allen kill anybody? No. Was she investigated by the homicide division? No. So get out of here with Brenda Allen. Go away. Go away. It's just no. There is nothing to show that other than and a lot of people want to believe, the film noir trope that the cops are all on the take and that kind of stuff. And it's like it's a lot harder to sell. No, it was a state of the art investigation. And I got to know. I became friends with one of the guys who worked homicide at the time. He didn't work the Black Dahlia case, but he was working homicide, and he was as straight arrow as you could get. And he was pals with Jack Donahoe, who was head of homicide. And these guys were absolutely straight arrows. It's like, no, absolutely not under any circumstances. So the LAPD being corrupt, the LAPD being on the take, didn't happen. That's just more Steve Hodel BS. So let's see. Will the myth and legend of George Hodel fade after Steve dies, or is it here for good? Boy, I would have to look into my glass ball, into my crystal, to figure out that one. I think it will taper off somewhat, simply because Steve Hodel has spent the last 21 years of his life tirelessly working to establish his father as this prolific serial killer. And I always I like to take the pulse of where the Black Dahlia is in popular culture, what's being written about it, what's on Wikipedia, what's on social media, Instagram, Twitter, what's on Reddit. And in the last couple of years, there's been a lot more pushback against Steve and all of his claims. People, especially with Zodiac. Once Steve went and said, "Oh yeah, Dad was Zodiac," and that's a whole nother conversation. But once Steve said, "Oh yeah, my dad was Zodiac as well," then he lost a lot of followers. There are some people who will just repeat verbatim just what Steve's claims. But beyond that, there's a lot more pushback than there used to be. You have to remember that Steve has to work constantly to keep this going. He has to write more books, do interviews. He's got to keep it going, because otherwise it falls apart. Okay, 10:58. I am going to lose you, Instagram, because otherwise Instagram will eat the video, and that would be sad. Okay, goodbye, Instagram. Okay, let's see. So that's pretty much it. Let's see. Are there any other? I don't really know. I mean, Steve has done a lot of damage, in terms of just when somebody who is unfamiliar with the story comes up and says, "Well, George Hodel was the prime suspect." That's Steve Hodel. When there's a lot of damage that he has done, and he's done a lot of damage to a lot of people. It certainly isn't just me. He's caused a lot of pain and a lot of grief for Elizabeth Short's family. All the other people he's accused. Guy named Thad Brown, who was deputy chief. He accused Thad Brown and his brother Finus, who was one of the lead detectives, of being corrupt and on the take and all that kind of thing, none of which is true. So he's done dirt to a lot of people, not just me, and even within his own family. There's a lot of bad blood within the Hodel family over Black Dahlia Avenger, which is why he wrote it in secret. He didn't write it in secret because it was a criminal investigation. He wrote it in secret because he didn't want his family to know what the hell he was up to. And I tell you what, we are coming up on 11 o'clock. The hour has gone fast. Thanks everybody for sticking around. It's been fun. It always is. And We'll do it again in a little over a month. October 29th. So it'll be the end of October. And remember, no Black Dahlia for Halloween. Don't do it. Don't do it. Do not dress up like the Black Dahlia for Halloween or ever. Don't dress up like a murder victim, like a real murder victim for don't do that. Find something else. Okay? Do Harley Quinn. I don't know. Anyway, okay, gang. See you next time.